Kick us off. So I'm Jason Lang. I'm the founder president for BloomBoard. Super excited about the conversation and a lot of the work in Illinois. And so happy to be here with you.
Hi, everybody. I'm Carrie Frank, Senior Account Manager here at BloomBoard. I have the pleasure of working with all of the Illinois districts who have come into the fold and work with us and help elevate their paraprofessionals and their teachers in our programs. So thank you for being here.
That's cool.
Hello, everybody. I'm Rovel Pollock. I am the Assistant Superintendent for HR at Marquardt School District 15. Really excited about that transitioning. But initially, I was in Valley View School District as the Director of Human Resources, where we essentially started a teacher pipeline, working with BloomBoard.
Great. I'm Bob Gurney. I'm the Assistant Superintendent for Human Resources over in Wheeling School District 21. And we worked with BloomBoard last year on also a teacher pipeline.
Love it. And so we're super excited about the conversation. I know we're going to record this, so send it out. I know we had a whole bunch of folks sign up, so excited to sort of engage. Obviously the Teacher Vacancy Grant is a pretty interesting, pretty sort of amazing way to sort of help districts really invest in and sort of value staff and really think about sort of how do we rebuild the pipeline in the process. So really excited to sort of dig in and obviously want to make sure that Dr. Pollock and Bob can share their perspectives in sort of how this has been going. Just as a quick overview, we'll jump in a little bit sort of on some of the BloomBoard background sort of very quickly, and then really want to dig into sort of the, your experience in the first year of the Teacher Vacancy Grant, how it went, what it looks like, and then really sort of open it up some Q&A. We can talk through a whole bunch of sort of questions on sort of, thoughts, considerations, things you'd, want to sort of try to improve for the second year in the process and sort of, and then open up to the group. So why don't we just sort of jump in pretty quick here, from the BloomBoard side of things, really what we know, and I think this is obviously the impetus of the Teacher Vacancy Grant is we're in an interesting place, right? In terms of attrition, in terms of just sort of current teacher pipelines, right? This is actually the Illinois scorecard data from the latest round that just is bad and getting worse, unfortunately, in terms of just sub shortages, parapools being sort of shallow, ed prep sort of enrollment. And really systemically, I think that what we're seeing more broadly in the field is that we are frankly just running out of 20-year-olds to actually staff schools. And right now, if you overlap the retirement curve data and the attrition data with the ed prep enrollment, it gets pretty bad in the next few years. And we're really trying to figure out sort of what do we do about that? How do we get ahead of this sort of really painful time where we may not have enough bodies to actually open classrooms? And a lot of the research, a lot of the data has really pointed to this idea of what does it mean to actually start to create a more sort of community-centric approach to how we think about solving that shortage. And in particular, are there folks inside of our ranks, inside of our school districts already that would like to be fully certified? And we've now surveyed thousands of paras and subs to see, would you want to be certified and why not? And what comes back pretty regularly is, right, majority, 50–60% of all of the candidates we survey say that they'd love to be fully certified and they've wanted to for a while, but they just feel locked out of the system. And that's typically because, right, they're an adult. And in most cases, it's because they didn't earn a bachelor's degree in the normal course when they were 20s and they had a family and then they had a second job, right? And they're sort of, sort of working through trying to get by, but there's just no way for them to go back and get a degree on top of their existing life because frankly, the degrees are designed for a ton of logistics that are really built for 20-year-olds. And the idea that we could start to all of a sudden rethink what the higher ed delivery model might look like and really design it for a working adult, working sort of in a day full-time job and build it into their day job so that it's more of an on-the-job degree rather than a degree that you got to go nights and weekends courses. That's a really crazy, interesting idea that all of a sudden could create a ton more equity and access into the pipeline. It has a ton of potential to really diversify the workforce because we know our paras, our long-term subs, right, actually match our student demographics. And if we want more Black and brown teachers in front of students, right, this is a really critical way to help sort of support those efforts. And because of all the residency data that we know, right, we know that the more sort of on-the-job feedback candidates get, not only the better instruction they deliver, but also the more likely they are to stay longer in the classroom. So there's a ton of really high quality work there. And then ultimately, it's about how do we access a bunch of this new funding. And so in addition to the teacher vacancy grants, we're already going through the process to look at workforce funding and incumbent worker dollars and doing all sorts of work to just continue to try to add to the funding structures here to make these pathways sustainable. So that's really the sort of the core is sort of who are we trying to serve is sort of build new degree models inside of the community, inside of your existing sort of pathways, inside of your existing sort of support staff, support professionals, because we know that's a way to grow your own future talent from within. And that the way that we do that, the sort of the super quick background is it's really about designing a new version of the higher ed system to be able to sort of take a model and say, well, if I'm working on, right, sort of a traditional degree, my ed prep, right, most of our ed prep here, right, came from, you know, classrooms that look like this, where frankly, right, you learn a lot of theory. And I was joking, even at Stanford, it's a wonderful school, but I had these old school professors who used to play these videos from 30 years earlier, and he would pause the video periodically and say, all right, which student is in his or her zone of proximal development? And we would debate ZPDs for an entire class session. It was just mind-numbing and painful. And yet I paid thousands of dollars for that 3-credit course to go on a transcript, right? And I, you know, got in front of kids and I was like, there's nothing about a ZPD in any classroom I've ever been in the real world. And so the idea that all of a sudden we can work with higher ed and change the delivery of that same 3-credit course and build it into the actual job of a para who's working full time, and where our paras are actually taking their lesson plans, they're videotaping themselves deliver those lesson plans, they're taking sort of student work coming out of that instruction, and we're using those artifacts to actually confer that same 3-credit course. That's a super powerful shift in the world and really does a lot to sort of change how we think about the ways we can support our adults and our support professionals into getting degrees and into becoming great educators and fully certified sort of staff. And so that's really the crux of it. And ultimately, the way we try to navigate that is really in sort of 2 halves. So we know today there's a really big gap between higher ed and school districts in terms of what is available and, frankly, the day-to-day logistics of your classrooms and of schools. And that it's really hard to ask either side to solve that problem. And so that's really what we do is we play a little bit of a bridge in between, and we have a whole portfolio of higher ed partners. And then we sort of help pre-package and build that sort of residency-like structure all the way into the fabric of the schools. And the way that we do that is we sort of effectively are the learning management system for our courses. And so faculty are still running the courses inside of the higher ed institution, and the candidates are engaging in those courses, but it's in our technology, which means we get to track every click. And therefore, we are always watching and looking and trying to figure out what's going on. And as we build that residency management sort of layer, we know exactly who needs support and exactly where they are in the process. And so we're constantly sort of monitoring and seeing what else can we do to help support candidates to be successful. And then we align it to all the licensure requirements with ISB in the process. We've been through all of that. We're designing these funding playbooks to help go get as much additional funding as we can, even outside of the Teacher Vacancy Grant dollars. And then we're obviously helping with candidate selection support and really digging into this idea of how do we make the system work faster. So even one of the early pieces of feedback we got from the vacancy grant in year 1 was a bunch of the candidates we went to recruit didn't have an associate degree. And most programs in the apprenticeship world, most programs in the space are sort of degree completion from associate to bachelor's. And we said, well, what do we do about these candidates who have less than 60 credits? And so we went back to one of our higher ed partners and said, hey, we've got a whole bunch of candidates here who don't have enough, right? Or either have 0 credit or have some small number of credits, don't have an associate's. How do we help support them? And that we worked with them and say, well, what if we could design a 0 to 120 credit bachelor's in special ed or bachelor's in elementary ed, where you could get all 120 credits in 3 years. And that would be a really amazing way to not only sort of accelerate the pathway, but to create an even more job embedded approach to sort of now you can say to a working paraprofessional, what if you could earn your bachelor's degree in 3 years entirely as part of your day job while working full time? And that whole process of this sort of on-the-job degrees is really what we've been sort of working with districts, and we're super excited about the work that's been happening across Illinois. And so that's just sort of the quick BloomBoard overview, but really the idea is that there is a future coming in the next few years, where no matter where you are in your professional journey, and I would argue if you're going to do the best social good you can do and become a teacher for society, right, and help kids, no matter where you are, you should be able to get a degree entirely on the job so that you're not spending nights and weekends away from your family, and you should be able to do it at no cost, right? Where your district and other funding sources are paying for it. And that's a world that we're moving into that we're super excited about. So enough about sort of our world. Really want to get into sort of the actual reality. And obviously there's a lot of the conversations about sort of how is this played out? What does this look like? And so we'll talk a little bit, and I'll turn it over to Dr. Pollock. We can start with you in terms of just talking through, as you were thinking about this from the sort of Valley View lens, right? How did that play out? Sort of how are you thinking about sort of, what programs in sort of the candidate sort of perspective, and just sort of walk us through sort of the high level of the sort of what you ended up sort of supporting here. And then we'll dig into some of the questions in the sort of process.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Jason. I always get really excited talking about BloomBoard and the opportunity that it afforded our educators in Valley View, specifically because it essentially had just been a dream of ours in terms of how do we remove barriers for our paraprofessionals, and how do we make this opportunity just accessible and essentially approachable, right? Because as Jason called out, many of our paraprofessionals, either one, there was a financial aspect which prevented them from accessing their education so that they essentially could earn that certification, or there was a time management issue, right? So with that being said, last year and every year, we are strengthening our program, but last year we essentially took a look at our paraprofessionals that would qualify. To Jason's point, most of those parapros at least had an associate degree. We also thought about those folks who came with us who had a provisional license. So when you think about your bilingual educators who currently don't necessarily hold a license, but they need supports as well. So we also extended this opportunity to our bilingual educators. To that end, most of our educators, to be honest with you, your paraprofessionals, most of them at least had a bachelor's degree. So many of our educators became a part of the MAT program. This year, I believe we will have a few who are essentially slated for the bachelor's program as well. Most of our educators, the way we took a look at it, were what are our hard to fill positions, right? So we all know that we share some of the same challenges when we go into job fairs. It's really hard to find those special education teachers. It's specifically hard to find special education teachers who are bilingual speakers. We also took a look at our math candidates because we also have an issue with finding math educators. So we essentially offered two pathways for our paraprofessionals. We do have a couple who are seeking endorsements, an English endorsement, but again, we are attaching the special education aspect to it, or LBS 1 to all of those.
Bob, can you share a similar sort of overview just in terms of sort of how you all, sort of went through it, sort of the process, sort of what that sort of overview looks like?
A lot of the same thoughts as Rovel. We didn't think about the bilingual, the short-term licensure that they have. So I really like that idea. And I'm going to steal that if that's okay.
Absolutely.
But we really focused
at the end of the day.
We focused on special ed. And Carrie and her team were wonderful as far as, look, we have elementary, we have this. And I said, we need special ed. So every offering we had for our staff, whether it was a TA, because we've got 6 or 7 TAs that are in a program right now, the TAP program, whether it was the TA or the current teacher who's getting an endorsement in SPED, we had to focus on SPED because we're short every year and we need so many SPED teachers. The BloomBoard group had a really nice kind of setup to ensure not only that people felt comfortable with the program, they presented and kind of prepped people and got them ready for it. And then we kind of worked through a process of interviewing and deciding who was going to be eligible for the program. Some people knocked themselves out, like we talked about, because they didn't have enough credits or they had too many credits. We didn't go the MAT route for last year, but we'll be looking at that for the upcoming school year. We got really great feedback. The teachers were really appreciative of the TAs. I think the biggest one was the TAs because, we talk about time, we talk about money. I think a lot of our TAs have this job because of the insurance. And to leave your job for 6, 8, 10 weeks, and yes, we all have COBRA, they have the option of COBRA, but our insurance, 85% is paid for by the district. So all of a sudden have no income plus have to pay the insurance is a huge deal for our TAs. And they just can't do it, a lot of them. We probably have 2 a year that just kind of take that leap. So we were excited that they'd be able to continue working. And we think that's a really nice pathway for access to all these staff members. We just wish we had even more money. We had a lot of money from the state. And if we'd gotten 10 times as much, I think we would have continued to find more people that would have done something.
Yeah, can you talk a little bit, and just for both of you, can you talk a little bit about that sort of selection process and sort of the application process, and just sort of how that sort of, you know, rolled out, how you sort of thought about, right, sort of the surveys for candidates and what that looked like in terms of sort of how to find the right ones in the process?
Absolutely. And I do want to go back to what Bob says as I talk through that process, as BloomBoard has been quite helpful in terms of helping us understand the pathway for different candidates. We all know that our job is extremely complex. And so sometimes we don't necessarily have an opportunity to necessarily study an additional program. But what I do love is the fact that BloomBoard partners with you and just take a look at your candidate pool, and not only take a look at the candidate pool. So in the spring, we hosted an informational session, and essentially that signified or signaled to us our aspiring candidates that would be ideal for this program, just because they took some time in the afternoon to come and learn more about it. And so BloomBoard was there to present out the program and the different pathways, and to answer specific questions that we might not have been equipped to answer, just because we don't know some of the nuances relative to the apprenticeship. From there, we created an online application. And so essentially our paraprofessionals, they answer maybe 2 to 3 questions. It wasn't anything that was too lengthy. And after they answered those questions, that's when we began to vet them through their school principals. And so would they be an ideal candidate just based on what you've seen? Because essentially we were looking for paraprofessionals, whereas if you walked into the classroom, you wouldn't be able to distinguish the teacher from the paraprofessional. And so those were some of the questions that we asked our principals. Also, aside from that, once the principals vetted and said, yeah, absolutely, they are ideal candidates, I would hire them in a heartbeat. It's just that they don't have the license. We brought them in for an interview. And again, it wasn't a lengthy interview, but we did want to talk about like their ability to prioritize, because while, yes, this isn't a conventional program, you still have to prioritize your time. There's still a level of commitment. So we talked through that. And then also, you know, we kind of had a baseline, like we'd like for you to be in the district for at least 3 to 4 years. However, we had some candidates who they've been residents in our community for a lifetime, right? And so those candidates were prioritized, or if we had alumni who decided to come back and to like work for the district, those candidates also were prioritized. After that meeting, we sent, you know, an acceptance letter. And then after the acceptance letter, we gave them some critical dates, such as orientation in terms of when they have to get in their application. And then from there, essentially when class would start and next steps. So that's our overall process in terms of how we go about selecting, vetting, and then identifying paraprofessionals who we think would be ideal for the program.
Bob, do you have anything to add there in terms of other systems sort of work that you're all doing?
We had a similar process. I think the only thing we got very lucky with was just setting the expectation of what this looks like afterwards. For the TAs, they were excited for a special ed position, so they were all in. But for some of our teacher candidates or teachers who were looking for the SPED endorsement, we probably had 20 people that said they were interested. But then when we said, that means you're going to be a special ed teacher when you get this, we had 18 step away. It was like, well, we want you to get the endorsement, but we need you to use it afterwards with us. So I think that was a way to kind of discern between the people that were just looking for a bump in the salary versus I want to become a special ed teacher.
And certainly we found, I mean, I think that the candidate selection, and in particular, just that sort of shoulder tap process and the interviews that sort of principals do, like, I think that also just speaks a ton, right? A lot of what we hear from candidates time and time again is, right, they feel like it's one of these sort of systems where they've often written off the idea that they were going to get a degree and get that next step because it just didn't seem possible. And so all of a sudden, if your boss, right, if your principal, right, is coming to you and saying, hey, I think you'd be great for this, and we'd want to invest in you and really sort of value your experience and help you in this process, it just changes that dynamic from, right, sort of one that sort of often feels like there's not a ton of upward mobility, right, and that you're still just trying to sort of struggle to get by, to all of a sudden one that's like really sort of heartfelt in terms of actually sort of the appreciation towards what it means to sort of get into these sorts of programs and get through some of these pretty big systemic barriers that we know exist in the system as a whole. So I know one of the things we talk about, you know, I mentioned it as we just sort of jump in, and certainly I want to make space for Q&A. So if you have, I'll keep tracking the chat here. If any of y'all have questions, feel free to just write them in the chat. I'll make sure we sort of get through them. But want to just sort of talk through a little bit sort of higher level, like as you think about sort of how year one went, right? What do you feel like are sort of the biggest wins that you saw there? And what did that look like in terms of sort of what were some of the things that surprised you?
I'll jump in for Rovel. Our biggest win, I'm just so excited about, is we have 100% of the people continuing. So no one has dropped out, and I think that's a huge win for them, for our district. But probably a little bit higher than that one, even though the 100% is really fantastic. One of the teachers who was getting their SPED endorsement got a temporary allowance from the state, a short-term allowance, and she's going to be a SPED teacher with us this fall.
Love it.
Because she'd already started the process, because she'd already started taking some classes, took the tests, she's already going to be a SPED teacher with us, and she has to finish up, I think, 1 or 2 more classes.
Amazing.
So we're excited for her.
It's a win, Bob. That's a real win, right? I'd love to talk to you a little bit about that and how that happens. Yeah, I love that. I think similar, you know, the win is one in terms of, you know, the participants who's still a part of the program, and it's even more exciting to know next year this time we'll be able to hire them. I think what also is a win, just when we had our informational this year, we had a packed house, right? Word of mouth is the best marketing ever. And I'll say this, we didn't do the greatest job like marketing online, but because of the experience, the supports, I want to say our interest grew in comparison to last year. And even just, oh goodness, the motivation, right? We had just some dynamic testimonials from our peer professionals to speak to what their colleagues talked about relative to their experience this year. So those were some major wins for us this year. And again, just knowing we are going into our second cohort. And so essentially, we'll be readying over 20, you know, educators for our classrooms for hard to fill positions.
Love it. Yeah, it's been one of these funny data points that's come up where I don't even think on the BloomBoard side we quite realize that there's a little bit of this, like, this doesn't feel real, or it feels a little too good to be true, right? We saw this in South Bend a bunch with our sort of work there, where we had a bunch of sort of candidates come back and say, like, it just doesn't seem like you can get a degree on the job while working full time. Like, that seems like you're selling me some, you know, some snake oil in the process. And so what happens, like, our first cohorts generally tend to start a little small, and then the word gets out. And then once the word gets out, you just see a whole new, we saw this in D88 with Bellwood, right? We've seen this in a whole bunch of places in other districts where once word gets out, and be like, no, it's real. Like, you can actually earn a degree on the job as part of just a good coaching program in the district. And that's been a really amazing, right? Sort of, it's part of that retention number, right? I think overall across the hundreds, thousands of candidates we have a 95+ completion retention rate. And many of our higher ed partners would say before working with us, that might be below 40% in the normal world, because, right, there's just a lot of life that happens and sort of pulls people out of programs. So the fact that the moment your degree and your job become the same experience, right, you're going to do both. You're going to likely do both really well. And so it's a really interesting way to see how that plays out in the actual sort of real world.
Jason, I think another piece of that is when you talk to graduates and they tell you how prepared they feel in the classroom. That, as someone who was a career switcher myself, I felt wholly unprepared after my traditional experience going to a university. I was kind of in there like, what? I don't know how to handle this and this. And just to hear that they feel completely prepared and kind of at ease to start teaching and to do it. And obviously a lot of that comes from having been a para or being in the program. But I had one teacher who was actually a veteran teacher going through a master's program who said to me, Carrie, I feel sorry for all of the students I taught for 20 years before I started this program, because I'm learning so many actionable things. I was like, oh, that is the best news for me, because that's exactly what, why I'm here and I'm committed to this. And she was just like, I really do. I'm just such a better teacher because I understand my students better, and I have more processes and things to put in place to help them be more successful. And so that's one of the things too, is hearing from the participants when they graduate and are going through the program, that I think for me stands out a lot.
Wow, Carrie, I'm so happy you called that out, because I didn't necessarily think about that. But if you think about the paraprofessionals who's going through the program, essentially you already don't know who's the teacher in comparison to who's the paraprofessional. You essentially, once the program is over, you get a master teacher. And how many of us, when we hire a first year teacher, they are a master teacher and they're really ready to go. So that would be a major, that's a byproduct, right? And it would be a major benefit to everyone.
We have one of our bigger districts in Florida. They actually had it sort of just happened out of circumstance, but their HR, their assistant superintendent over C&I, right, came to a cabinet meeting and had just finished their entire set of walkthroughs for instruction rounds where they were walking through classrooms, and the C&I sort of assistant super didn't know which candidates were right in this associate teacher right sort of program versus which were their fully licensed teachers, and so they came back through. And they started listing off names of some of the highlights. And they're like, this classroom was pretty amazing, right? And the HR assistant super was like, that's one of our paras, that's now in this associate teacher program. And it happened over, they went through the list and it was a bunch of some of the best teachers they had were candidates in the active program. And they were just thought it was they were like, okay, well, I guess we were sitting on these folks for a while, just waiting for a way to sort of help them get through the process. And they're some of the best educators in the district. It's really, really pretty amazing. And so as you think about, now having learned what you've learned, sort of go through that, just interested in how you're thinking about year two, right? Sort of what is that, where have you started to shift focus? What does that look like given the sort of evolution and the just normal sort of process of things here?
I can go first. I think in terms of shifting thinking, in year one, you didn't necessarily think about completion. And so wanting to make sure some of our participants, specifically those who are getting content-based endorsements like math, right? That's pretty hard. And so making sure that they successfully pass their tests, like their content tests. And so that will be a major shift for us, and being sure that we're checking in relative to that. So it's not just about course completion and if they are on track, but it really is about, okay, how are you in terms of preparing for your content test, or how are you relative to preparing for further certification? Like all of them will have to essentially sit for an assessment. So that will be a major shift for us. And then also thinking about, how will we transition those educators who are finishing, having systems and structures in place to support that, as they've had a lot of systems of support, but what does that look like as they are looking to pursue jobs within the district?
We're going to be looking during the year two, looking at that MAT option, because we didn't, tackle it last year, and kind of seeing how this progresses for this first group to learn from them, and learn from the mentors too, the navigators, to really kind of tap into them and see what we could do differently on our end. I was talking to Carrie the other day about the summit we went to last year offered by BloomBoard, and one of the panelists said, we just realized somebody needed some extra time. And I was like, oh my gosh, this person's been so far behind. That's what they need. And I called that person up immediately. I left and went during the break, and I called her up and I said, do you just need time? She's like, that's all I need. So we gave her a day to work at the school in the library and work with the LMC person, because she was having problems transferring documents and just some basic things. She had a lot of stuff done. She ended up using 2.5 hours and then went back to work. But she needed that time where the LMC person, the library person, was there. And then we're also going to be looking at, we've also reached out to LinkedIn to do a little test for 6 months to see what that looks like as far as trying to find more candidates out there.
Yeah, it's been interesting. I think, now, and I joke, a year or two ago, we started talking with districts about hey, how do you actually get to 0 vacancies? What does that look like? And is that possible? I think, having seen now what we've seen so far in the first year with the vacancy grant, like, and just seeing what we're seeing across the country, right, in Florida and Indiana, right, in sort of other states, like the idea that you can get to 0 vacancies in the next several years is very real. And I think that used to feel almost untouchable, especially in sort of medium-sized districts. But the idea that all of a sudden, right, the more you start to own your pipeline, right, and we have districts who have 100-person wait lists, but the more you start to really own your own pipeline, you start recruiting. We have folks in Sterling who they're already recruiting their recent high school grads and saying, hey, if you're not really concerned about, if you're concerned about debt and you don't really know what you're looking like, if I'll employ you the day you graduate into a para role, put you in an elementary school, I'll pay for you to get your bachelor's degree. And then you stay with me for 3-4 years. And it's, some of the best training you could get. They're going to get a 3-year bachelor's or less than that if they're already able to get an associate in high school. And so all of a sudden you get an accelerated bachelor's degree, you're working full time, and the candidate gets a ton of really good training where now we know corporate America can steal teachers or knows that teachers are super well trained to do pretty much anything in any job. And so it's a really great training ground for whatever future career you might want to do, but you can get a free bachelor's and you're just already working in the community that you grew up in, still trying to figure out sort of what you want to do. It's a really interesting place to start to think about that as the future pipeline, and really about sort of owning that process and now sort of going, starting from where we are, starting small, but really growing both directions, going up into the MAT pathway, but then also really starting to dip down into some of the recent high school grads, some of the sort of full degree options in terms of where you get there. I think we will see, in the coming years, like we're trying to sort of do a lot more work really deliberately on trying to understand what is getting the 0 vacancies mean and how do you build a very specific blueprint to make that happen. So pretty exciting sort of process. I guess as you think about sort of learnings, right? And as you think about sort of, the things that went well, things went wrong. Obviously, Bobby mentioned sort of the time sort of piece is an interesting one. I'm just interested in sort of, as you thought about this in sort of the more holistic sense of the grant, what were your biggest learnings in the process? And what were some of the surprises? What were some of the things that right, that if you're looking at somebody else trying to sort of figure this out, that you sort of give guidance on in terms of what you learned most valuably?
I think one of the things I'd recommend anyone do is tap into somebody that has worked with grants before, because the amendments are not hard on the ISB website, and yet they're not intuitive at all times. So you're clicking over here, then you're going over here, then you're getting approved, and you have to unlock this and unlock that, and then you can kind of do the step. So having a person that had worked with grants a lot helped me a tremendous amount. I also think it helped us we didn't know if the vacancy grant would be around the following year or the year after that. So we paid for everything the first year. So we limited the number of people we actually offered it to, because they're paid for their entire program now under the first year. So now with the second year grant, we can look at a new group of people and really open it up and try to pay for their whole piece right away.
The same. It's paying for your entire cohort within that first year of that grant, just to ensure that there's funding. And so that was, a major learning for us, or a takeaway going into year 2.
Okay. And then as you think about some of the sort of other pieces, like, are there challenges that you all sort of experienced in that process? Like as you sort of going through, right, sort of what things came up that you sort of, again, we know nothing ever goes super smoothly in the process. It's just the way the world works in the lens. I'm just sort of interested in what sort of challenges that you sort of be interested in sort of chatting through or sort of sharing more. And again, want to make sure we open it up to Q&A for folks as well. If you've got questions that we can sort of answer, I've got a whole list here, but I want to make sure we're responsive to the group. But any specific challenges that you were sort of interested in?
I think the virtual piece is nice. And we did a nice job BloomBoard did a nice job of presenting, and we can connect with people with email, but as a former school principal, I don't see the people every day, and being able to really check in with them like that, like, hey, how you doing? How's it going? And I think that feels a lot different than an email. So looking at year 2, I think I'll be visiting the schools more and checking in with these people personally. We have 13 schools. It's a big district, but I do think that personal touch will be important for them as they're growing.
I think we forecasted what could be a major challenge, and it's similar to what Bob called out. However, like within the grant, when we wrote the grant, we have essentially a facilitator. We brought back a retired principal who she's had connections in the district. She knows tons of folks, so she already kind of had that capital, that human capital. And that being said, she goes into the school and she's doing those personal checkpoints to be sure that one, she serves as a liaison between the school administrator, the mentor teacher, and then the para. So making sure everybody is like speaking the same language and they are within the know in terms of where we are, where the para is. And then she also helps like them navigate through challenges, right? Because a lot of our educators, they aren't necessarily instructional coaches. While they may be high performing, it's hard for them to articulate like their practice and what it is they're doing to materialize things that occur in their classroom, specifically how they're advancing outcomes. And so that being said, you know, she serves as that liaison and she helps them articulate or translate like that knowledge to our parapros. And so she's been a game changer. I think if we hadn't anticipated that, I don't know how successful we would have been this school year. So yeah.
Yeah, you both sort of touch on this idea of sort of the progress monitoring sort of side of the work, which I do think is one of these areas where, you know, it's just hard in the normal higher ed world, right? You're sort of used to telling candidates like, all right, go get a degree. Good luck. Let us know how it goes. And you sort of see at the end. Obviously, like our world's pretty different because that's the whole reason, because we're sort of managing that learning management system and managing all the coursework inside of the sort of technology. Like we're doing every week, every other week sort of check-in. So it'd be just interesting as your thoughts on how that sort of progress monitoring played out for each of y'all and what that looks like in terms of the sort of you know, ahas or sort of thoughts that you have in terms of how that was helpful in sort of just supporting folks through the process.
I thought it was fantastic. The color coding that the BloomBoard team does, and then the check-ins every other week were really helpful. And like I said, when I was in that the summit, I knew exactly who to call, who was struggling, and who to provide extra support for. It wasn't wondering, hey, who needs help? Because a lot of times they won't answer that question. They'll just be like, it's not me, I don't want to be the one failing. And yet she just needed a little boost. And I think that color coding kind of progress monitoring helped us so much in making sure that we're getting everybody across the finish line.
Yeah, just as kind of example, so in our world, you know, we're tracking every artifact and every click in the system, and so we're pretty maniacal about, you know, not from a big brothery lens, but just from an understanding like, are you on pace, right? We know that these are not easy degrees, and there's a lot to do to earn and build all the artifacts and do all the videos and do all the lesson plans, but we know exactly the moment you get behind. And that's where we start to green, yellow, red, right? Who's on track? Who's ahead, right? Who's starting to fall a little bit behind? And so those are always the questions that we're trying to raise and trying to be ahead of, to say, okay, right, if something comes up, right, life comes up all the time. So if something comes up, how do we sort of put someone down as yellow and say, all right, you know, someone might need a little extra space and a little extra grace here. How do we sort of help in that process? Just to sort of give some more sort of quick, you know, sort of RTI of sorts in the process. Dr. Pollock, anything that you... anything on the
did you ask any? Did you ask?
Oh, I was thinking. I so you were chatting with somebody else. Any other thoughts you would share just on sort of the check-ins or sort of the broader sort of candidate monitoring side of things from your end?
Yeah, no, absolutely. Going back to the facilitator, she was extremely instrumental. She met bi-weekly with me, BloomBoard, Carrie, Christy, and Michaela, and taking a look at who's where and following up in the moment. And again, she's made a lot of those personal connections because it's all relational, and just being able to say, hey, look, this is what I'm noticing. And people were pretty, you know, straightforward with her in terms of where they were, where they stood, and what the issues were. So it's critical to have an assigned person who can, you know, who have time to make those connections. And it's just a simple phone call.
And I think in particular, in this sort of is a good segue into sort of, you know, as you think about sort of adult learners, right, which is really the core of, I think, a lot of this work is how do you sort of redesign this sort of adult learning experience, right, for candidates who are working full time. I'm just sort of interested in sort of how you think about sort of that structure and sort of what feedback or sort of candidates sort of experience around specific that sort of full time, right, while people are working, right? Sort of what barriers have you sort of come across? What have you sort of seen, right, just from that adult learning experience in the degrees? And how has that come up and how has that shaped sort of the thinking in terms of where you're heading, just from a, you know, an adult candidate, sort of a full-time sort of employed candidate perspective?
I think we vetted pretty well, and people really, really wanted this. And I think because of that, that was the motivation. I almost, you know, Jason, when you were talking earlier, I was actually relating it to my Type 75. You know, when I was getting my Type 75, I was in the school. The principal was right down the hall. I could go work with him really closely and work on a project here or a project there. And a lot of different things that I was already doing as a teacher would relate to that Type 75.
Yep.
So it kind of overlaid with it. And I think that's really helped our teachers or our students, if you will.
Love it. Anything you
Yeah,
add some of the barrier side of things and we talked on?
I'd have to agree with Bob. We didn't really encounter too many barriers. I think the only barrier that we really had was one, you know, participant who hold a provisional license. She wanted to accelerate the program even further, right? So like, can I take more courses? I think we did a nice job vetting, supporting, and I think that that's key. Like, this isn't a program that you just say, hey, we have this program, how about you participate? You do have to be thoughtful if you want it to be a success. And if you want district buy-in, like if you want your principals to buy in, your APs to buy in. So it definitely has to be a process that you really think about, specifically when you're identifying participants. So we didn't have tons of challenges.
Love it. Well, and I know we're getting tight on time here, so if there's other questions, but I think the last big question that came up that I think was a little unique in this year's grant was really around sort of sustainability. And as you're thinking about sort of some of the sustainability pieces here, I know, you know, it's always the question of like, who knows what next year's budget or any budgets in the future hold, because that's the world we live in. Just sort of interested in how you're thinking about sustainability, sort of how you've sort of gone about that, how you've sort of been talking about that from the board's level. Sort of what does that look like for each of your sort of program structures?
We had started an ESL cohort a couple of years ago because we were seeing a lot of our teachers didn't have that ESL endorsement. So we already started that a few years prior to BloomBoard jumping in and helping us out. I think one of our next steps is going to be really connecting better with the high school district that we feed into. They've got an apprenticeship program with about a dozen different options for their students. And one of them is early childhood education. So really kind of connecting with them. I spoke or I heard from a school district in Texas and one in just south of Naperville. And they both have been utilizing the Grow Your Own program as early as elementary school and have found a lot of success. The district I listened to in Denton, Texas, they said they've had 70 people in their program come back as either teachers or TAs, paraprofessionals. It was about half and half, which was really, really amazing. So to really tap into that 5th and 6th grade and middle school, even before they potentially get disenfranchised in high school.
Yeah, love it.
I think similar, we do have a few programs, or Valley they had a few programs relative to tuition reimbursement. So obviously you would want to remain consistent in that. There are certain grants that parapros would goodness, what am I looking for? Qualify for, right? And so helping them to navigate that. And then also we are working with our local workforce who essentially they have money or potentially could help us fund this program as well. And given we do have an apprenticeship program, you know, we qualify for that. And so it's not about waiting until the last minute. We've started those conversations, those partnerships, so that when we don't necessarily have the vacancy grant, that will be an option as well. I think, you know, I'd highly encourage people to, you know, look for other funding sources even now, even though you have another year of the grant, essentially, hopefully, to begin those partnerships and trying to figure out how you can fund beyond the teacher vacancy grant.
And certainly there's just been a lot of work across the country right now on some of these apprenticeship pathways, the workforce pathways, right? There's a bunch of sort of other areas in there. And obviously now, you know, that we actually built one of the first apprenticeship applications in Illinois was super exciting for teacher sort of pathways. So it's a really interesting time to see how we can sort of help stave off some of the shortage implications in the process. And so really excited to see where it all goes. Any other questions from the group here? Any other final thoughts that y'all would share in terms of just sort of your experience with the vacancy grant so far in the process?
Overall, I think, we just spoke to our level of excitement. I think it is a wonderful program. Not the fact that it's just wonderful, the supports that comes along with the program. Oftentimes when you want to launch a program, and specifically when you're trying to garner buy-in, because people are skeptical, like, is this a real thing? It's the level of support that you get from BloomBoard. That's what has been most exciting and helpful for us in terms of garnering buy-in. And so overall, again, it is about being extremely thoughtful, well planned out, but at the end of the day, there isn't a lot of back work because you have so much support. And so those would be my final thoughts, Chase.
I would just echo everything you just said. It was perfectly done.
Yep.
Well, unless there's any final Q&A from the audience, I just want to say thank you so much for joining us here. Again, really excited about sort of the work that's happening. I know this is, this will be even more of a crazy year ahead as we sort of keep going and keep expanding things. And again, as we have our first D65, we'll have our first graduating bachelor's degree candidates, 10 for 10, 100% graduation rate so far. We'll have our first graduating cohorts this fall, so we're super excited. And it's been, we do these signing ceremonies, and we'll do a graduation ceremony for them, and it'll be pretty amazing, right? There's not a dry eye in the house because it's just a pretty amazing, amazing opportunity that the district created, and that we were able to sort of really help garner. So really excited about all of your support. Thank you so much for the time, and thank you all for joining us. We look forward to sort of following up and see what else we can do to be helpful. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.